everyone. My name is Ms. Venezuela, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at Cal Sacramento. Today I'm going to be presenting a pilot study that I undertook last year, and it's called Testing the Reconceptualization of Deterrence Theory and Assessing the Deterrent Effect of Deportations among Latinos. So very quickly, just to kind of introduce the context of this study, I have a quote that most of you guys might be familiar with from our current president, and it's, "But you have people coming in and I'm not just saying Mexicans, I'm talking about people that are from all over, that are killers, rapists, and they're coming into this country." So this kind of puts it into context, as Manuel mentioned, that we focus so much on Latino immigrants as being somehow more blameworthy, more culpable, more likely to offend than any other ethnic or racial immigrant group. So we see that historically when Americans overestimate the number of immigrants, we start finding that they start enacting more restrictive and punitive policies. And we've seen that this has taken kind of more support over the last decade or so. We've seen that in a number of states, including Arizona, with the SB 1070 Show Me Your Papers law, where individuals felt targeted, not only undocumented immigrants, but those who were legal residents and including U.S. born Latinos. So in that context, people felt targeted only because of being Mexican or being perceived as Latino. Well, we see that more and more immigrants are going through the criminal justice system, especially at the federal level. We have about 30 million foreign-born living in the United States, the majority of which are Latinos. And looking at that more, we see that the majority of them are Mexican in terms of nationality. In terms of context, in 2015, we saw that there were over 200,000 deportations, and 69,000 of those were internal removals. The others were individuals that were apprehended at the border. So we see that it's still a significant number. And so we've seen that there's been a decline in the immigration flow. A lot of people kind of credit this idea of putting in these punitive policies to deter people from coming into the country, or to deter those who are here and have them remove themselves voluntarily. When I was living in Arizona, I would hear on the Spanish radio station that a number of people were abandoning their homes because they were in fear after SB 1070, or during the Sheriff Joe Arpaio days. So people were fleeing with their families to another state or going back to their country of origin. And so, like I said, a lot of people try to credit these ideas that if we're more punitive, if we punish more, then they'll be less likely to come over. But some people credit the economic recession. Well, when there are fewer jobs, there are fewer opportunities, and people are not as likely to come. And so some people also consider, well, if they're being abused and harassed, then they may not want to come over as much. But as the first presenter noted, for a lot of people, it's a sacrifice to come out here in the first place, leaving their family behind, leaving their lives behind. And they do that when they weigh the pros and cons. And that's what I'll talk about with deterrence theory. So this study aims to explore some of the reasons for the decline in migration flow to the U.S. with a specific interest in the role of deportation. And the theoretical framework that I'll use for that is deterrence theory. And I'll talk about that as the presentation goes on. So just a little bit of background. There are a number of myths and misconceptions about immigrants, especially those that are undocumented. For example, they're considered to be more criminally prone. We hear a lot about how they're bringing drugs into the country, they're rapists. In Arizona, they were allegedly responsible for beheadings that never really took place, with the former governor having to retract those statements. We see that these statements make and influence the way that Americans think about immigrants. So when you have politicians and the media perpetuating these negative immigrant stereotypes, people are more likely to vote people into power that are going to remove them or that are going to punish them. And we see that that's happening now, especially with the Trump administration. So one of the things that immigrants are often blamed for is this idea that they commit more crime than any other group, when the reality is that they are less likely to commit crime than native born. so we see that being an immigrant is actually a protective factor, not a risk factor for criminality. But yet that's not really known to the public, and when an immigrant does commit a crime, it makes national headlines, and then people start perpetuating this idea that it's all of them, not just the one. So when we focus on criminalizing immigrants, we do so with the idea that we're going to locate them, we're going to identify who they are, we'll prosecute and deport. And in the Southwest, we have this fast-track system in place because we don't want them to consume a lot of time in the court system. We don't want them to take up those resources. So we kind of do this assembly line justice, where we line everybody up in shackles, and everyone at the same time says culpable, guilty, and then they're just funneled out. And then the judge says, well, if you come back, I'm going to sentence you to the harshest penalty. And he has seen at the time that I went to go see one of these court proceedings, there were a number of people there that when they were asked, why did you come here? I heard from a sibling pair that came to the United States because their mother had cancer, and they had no way of being able to support themselves and support her, buy her the medication, so they came out to work. A number of people, that was the reason why they were here. They were coming here to work, to look for those opportunities, and send money back to their families. None of those were there because of a criminal act besides coming to the U.S. So the first offense would be a civil offense. After that, it becomes a criminal offense once you get deported. So, like I said, we see that at the state level, there are a lot of initiatives, and even at the local level, like in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, where people would be criminalized for renting an apartment, for getting a job, taking their kids to school, things of that nature. The more difficult they make it for them to live in the U.S., they think that they'll be more likely to deport themselves. And we've also seen that there's an expansion in the aggravated felon classification. So whereas it was a lot more difficult to get people deported based on certain charges, now we've facilitated that so that even with a petty crime like petty theft, they're still eligible for deportation. And the attorneys that are there to represent them are not really familiar with the way that the immigration system works. Most cases will get pled out. And so for documented immigrants who have to take a plea, this might mean that you will get deported and that you won't be eligible to come back. So not a lot of attorneys are familiar with this type of issue that can arise for this special population. And so, like I said, there's been an increased focus in initiating these state and federal level legislative efforts with the goal of deterring immigration as well as criminalizing them. And the way that we also criminalize individuals is through the inclusion of deportation in the criminal justice process. So even though immigrants are much more likely to be incarcerated, they serve shorter prison terms because the eligibility of deportation is available for them, unlike any other group. And so we've constructed this idea of the criminal aliens. And so you're not just punished for being a criminal per se, you're punished because you're a criminal who came here without the right to be here. You're punished for two things, being undocumented and being a so-called criminal. And so we've seen that there's both public and political support for this notion that deportation has a preventive effect on unauthorized migration. And this kind of serves the idea that if we increase border security, if we increase deportations, that somehow it'll alleviate this massive inflow of immigrants that so-called that's going on according to some people. And so the theoretical framework that I use for this study is the reconceptualization of deterrence theory. Basically, deterrence theory argues that people are rational beings, that they weigh the pros and cons before they commit any act. And so in this case, someone who might want to come into the country, they'll decide, well, I can get apprehended, I'll get deported, but I'll be able to come here, get a job, support my family. And so that doesn't always work. Not everyone uses rationality, especially in times of desperate need, like that sibling pair that I mentioned earlier. And so when you think about the reconceptualization of deterrence theory, it includes more than just specific and general deterrence. So when you use specific deterrence, you're specifically targeting one individual. Let's say Jane Smith commits a crime, we're going to incarcerate her. That would work for specific deterrence because you're specifically removing that person from society and you're deterring them from committing another crime. General deterrence would be like capital punishment. you would assume that people will not kill others because they know the death penalty is available and that would deter the masses. So with Stafford and War's idea of the reconceptualization of deterrence theory, they argue that it's not important to just look at the direct effect of specific and general deterrence, but also the effect of punishment avoidance and indirect punishment avoidance. So in this case, have people come into the U.S. and avoided being deported? Do they know of people who have come to the U.S. and avoided being deported? So those factors are also important to consider. So in the current study, the purpose of the study is to understand the role of deportation on entry and reentry. And I asked two research questions. The first is, do personal and vicarious experiences with deportation decrease the likelihood of future entry and reentry by increasing the perceived certainty of punishment? And second, do personal and vicarious experiences with punishment avoidance decrease an individual's perception of the certainty of punishment, thereby increasing the likelihood of future unauthorized entry? So with deterrence theory, it's basically comprised of three elements. There is certainty of punishment, whether the punishment is severe and whether it's swift. So the most important is certainty. If you know you're going to get caught doing something, then you're less likely to do it. Whereas we basically function under the idea that the more severe we are with our penalties, the less likely people are to offend. But the literature shows that that's not really supported. The main element should be certainty of punishment. And that's why I argue that when people think that they're more likely to get deported, it might stop them from coming into the country. So in spring of 2016, I traveled from Arizona to Nogales, Mexico, where I interviewed 15 people and asked them about their experiences with punishment avoidance, with direct punishment in terms of deportation. And I also asked them about their experiences going through the criminal justice system. And so these were semi-structured interviews that took between half an hour to an hour. I interviewed people at a place called El Comedor, where most of them go to receive first aid or meals, and also a women's shelter. And this is a photo of the Comedor. And this is done by a group, a nonprofit group that provides them basic aid. American doctors go there and provide first aid for them. They also take volunteers. So this was one of the locations where I interviewed people just on one side of the room, and then at the women's shelter where I interviewed others. So I'm currently going through the interviews and doing my reports on the findings, but these are some of the preliminary findings that I found. So neither the threat of deportation nor actual deportation had a deterrent effect on entry or reentry. So when I interviewed these individuals, they said, even though I've been deported, I plan on going back. I'm going to try to go back through Juarez, or I'm going to try to go back through Tijuana. But a lot of people told me that this was kind of their means of survival. Mm-hmm. One gentleman told me that he basically lives in what wouldn't even amount to a shack. It's aluminum pieces just kind of stuck together, where he has no food, no job opportunities. And so for a lot of people, this means survival. A lot of them shared with me that they had never been arrested before, either in the U.S. or abroad in their country of origin. And so for them, it was a really humiliating, demoralizing experience of being arrested, being searched, and some of them claimed that they were abused, so they were treated very harshly. And yet, they thought that the pros outweighed the cons in terms of not just survival, but giving themselves a better opportunity for life or their children. We still see that a lot of them are being enticed by this American dream. So for a lot of them who were living in the country for a number of years, I met a woman who lived here for 20 years. She has a daughter that's going to college, and the only reason she went back to Mexico was because one of her close relatives was literally on her deathbed, and it was going to be her only opportunity to see her. Well, when she tried to go back to the U.S., she found herself getting deported. She was unable to cross. And so a lot of these individuals, they live with this idea of punishment avoidance through that indirect punishment avoidance that I discussed. So whereas maybe 20, 30 years ago, it was a lot easier to come into the country, now that we've expanded the border wall, border security. We're making it much more difficult for people to enter through the US-Mexican border. So we've kind of pushed them off to a more dangerous and isolated terrain in order to deter them from coming into the country. And so all participants noted that even after being deported and or knowing the likelihood of deportation was high, they would not be deterred. They vowed to continue their attempts until they were successful. So I asked them, if you know that you're going to be apprehended at the border, not just once, but every time that you attempt to, how many times would it take for you to just stop? And they said, nothing's going to stop me until I can make it. So for them, it's not a matter of deterrence isn't really working. So the more difficult we make it, it's not going to stop them, because there are other things at play here. So some of the implications from this study are that it extends prior research on deterrence theory and immigration issues. It suggests that deportation does not serve as a deterrent, and we really have to reconsider how we allocate a lot of the resources that we put into immigration, rather than just focusing strictly on border security and on this idea that the much more difficult we make it for them to come into the country, that we're really investing in border security, that we're investing in having people be deterred from coming into the country illegally, because it's not really working. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for being here today. They were presenting a paper that we're working on together. These are the preliminary findings that Laura and I have been working on about sort of the identity and resistance amongst documented immigrants in the U.S. So, so this is sort of part of the sort of continuation of sort of, we heard historical papers about, you know, about what is going on and current policies that are really focused on border enforcement. And now with the election of Donald Trump, we see the ending of DACA. That was not, it was a temporary program, and yet it offered protections to a group of undocumented students. And so what does it mean to belong to an abject group that is as undocumented immigrants and to be targets of hostile rhetoric, laws, and enforcement in the U.S.? So you probably, in this audience, most of you know that in 2012, President Obama enacted a temporary temporary relief, a executive order to shield young immigrants from deportation, give them work permits, and it was temporary. And by the way, these sort of program is enacted after a lot of pressure from youth activists who really pushed the Obama administration to do this. But with the election of Trump, who campaigned on an anti-immigrant and anti-Mexican platform, he has promised to increase enforcement along the U.S.-Mexico border wall, and to increase enforcement within the U.S. and DACA. And finally, in September, it was announced that DACA was ending in March. And so, by the way, we are at an all-time net negative migration from Mexico. That means more Mexicans are leaving than entering. So obviously, this is not based on any facts. So we want to ask in this project, sort of what does it mean to be an abject subject? According to Judith Butler, the construction of an abject subject is necessarily a social process by which the categories of insider and outsider are established. And power is a key element of defining the abject subject as the other, as the outsider. And an example of bodies that have emerged as abject are undocumented immigrants whose bodies have been historically portrayed as invaders and threats to the nation, especially undocumented Mexican immigrants. And before DACA, there was research by Gonzalez and Chavez, who sort of published sort of what it meant to become undocumented for children. Gonzalez coined sort of the term of learning to be illegal. As children transition into adulthood, they had to learn to be illegal. And Lacey Abrego argued that that the institutions played a key role in incorporating immigrants. So for adults, the workplace, was key in sort of instilling fear of deportation. But for children, schools were a context where stigma and sort of shame emerged. And Irene Bloomrad et al. Argued that there have been three major frames by which activists and immigrant supporters have framed immigration in terms of economic benefits, in terms of human rights, and in terms of family unity. So we want to sort of ask in this post-DACA moment and in the context of the Trump election, what does it mean to now be this active subject? So we are using data from the New York Times. The New York Times basically asked documented students to share their stories publicly online about what it meant to be documented and what it will mean for that program to end. And so we, from January 14th to February 14th of 2012, 2017, we downloaded a total of 160 narratives from these documented youth who described their stories and what it meant to be documented and what it would mean if the program ended. When we analyzed all these interviews, most of them were from youth in Texas, California, and New York. And the gender composition of the stories were evenly distributed. And we kind of coded for background, and for the most part, most of the youth were with Latino sounding names, although sort of we are coding on Latino sounding names that will include some Filipinos. And so Laura is now going to report on our three preliminary findings. We're still in the process of analyzing the data.
So hi everyone, my name is Laura, and I'm going to talk about our findings. So we were able to identify three emerging themes, and those are dreaming, hoping, and challenging illegality. And the second one is fear, Trump, and an unknown future. And then the last one is enduring, resisting, and organizing. So for the first one, we argue that objectivity and illegality has been effectively dislocated by young immigrants, challenging the construction of illegality as an object status. However, they have been much less successful in challenging the broader narrative about the necessity of policing the border. This is in part because most youth still frame migration in terms of worthiness, rather than as a human right. We also found that immigrants relied on framing themselves as undocumented Americans, challenging their object status. They are not outsiders, they belong here. These immigrants also challenge notions of citizenship that are based on legalistic terms. They are citizens, yet they are not allowed to belong because they are undocumented. They do not only belong to the U.S., but also have actively contributed to the society. And a quote from that theme is Ari, who says, "I'm a taxpayer, entrepreneur, an undocumented American. I have lived here for 17 years. This is my home. This is the country I love." So we can see that for the most part, undocumented youth that answer to this call of the New York Times frames themselves as insiders, as Americans, and thereby challenging notions of belonging and citizenship that rely purely on legalistic terms. These framings of belonging effectively dislodge illegality and objectivity, while past research found that unauthorized immigrants who had arrived to the U.S. as children felt a deep sense of stigma based on their legal and object status. We found that documented immigrants do not feel a sense of stigma, shame, or sense of objectivity. They rarely claim belonging to the U.S. national fabric. So I have another quote right here from another participant who said, "We are more than Americans. We are Americans by heart, not by paper. We are part of the economy that will mold us to become professionals and contribute even more with passion and sacrifice." And then moving on to the DACA context, this was obviously before the official announcement of the end of DACA, which came on September 5th. But they were already fearing what was going to happen with DACA. So I have another participant. Actually, that's the one. So they acknowledged the importance of DACA, and they said, fortunately, DACA, quote, fortunately, DACA became active the year I graduated from high school. Through DACA, I have been able to continue fulfilling my American dream and paying for my education through the work permit it provided. So we can see that they acknowledge the importance of DACA and the difference that this executive action has, executive order, has made in their life and in the U.S. And it was key to opening doors and allowing them to fully participate in U.S. society. So moving on to our second theme, which is fear, Trump, and an unknown future. So many of the participants stated that they hope the politicians are able to see beyond their veil of the legality. So one of the participants, whose name is Pedro da Cruz, said, quote, now all we can do is hope that Trump and the Republicans will see that those of us under DACA are good, hardworking people. Pray that they work to fix immigration and not deport us to countries that we don't even know. So that brings me to my last theme, which is enduring, resisting, and organizing. So these narratives of this undocumented youth show the resilience that undocumented immigrants present by organizing and ensuring their stories show that they are more than criminals. They are functioning members of a society that denies their existence. They also show very critical voices that provide powerful changes to mainstream discussion about migration, illegality, and deservedness. So that this youth question their deservedness to belong in the U.S. fabric only because their contributions to the labor. In a way, DACA has shown them what's possible, and many of these youth are no longer fearful. For example, I have a DACA recipient who stated, quote, the loss of DACA could mean that I could lose my job and career, but this time it will be different. I am not the man I was 8 years ago. I am not afraid. This time I will fight for what I love and keep working with my students no matter what. Right there. So we can see that they assert time and again that they belong because this is their home, and freedom of mobility is, after all, a human right. So in conclusion, we highlight how the stories of these young immigrants also show their resilience in organizing and ensuring that their stories show how they are more than illegals, quote unquote. They are functioning members of a society that denies their existence. We ultimately show how the stories of these young immigrants also show their resilience in organizing and ensuring their stories show how they are more than what they are portrayed to be. We ultimately show how narratives of illegality and objectivity articulated by different located subjects do not have equal exposure to the mainstream narrative, which effectively reproduces the narrative that maintains the abject subject as an illegal and criminal subject.
Should the presenters come and sit over here and address questions?